started now?
Sure.
Okay. We are continuing now on with John Quincy Adams. And when we had left off, we were discussing that the South, especially South Carolina, and everything now that is going to lead us up to the Civil War is going to come out of South Carolina. South Carolina is going to be the hotbed of agitation. She reacts very angrily against the tariff of abominations, the tariff of 1828. The seaboard, the old seaboard, had been the first settled. It is now the least flourishing of the sections. The bustling Northeast was experiencing a boom in manufacturing up here in the Northeast. The Northwest was experiencing prosperity. The New South was growing cotton gangbusters. The Old South, though, has overcropped. Their land has petered out, and the prices of cotton was falling sharply. John Randolph, a Virginian, grimly quipped that masters would soon cease to advertise for their fugitive slaves, and slaves would advertise for their fugitive masters. So the Old South was seeking a scapegoat, and the tariff proved to be a convenient and plausible one. I said I was going to come back and discuss with you about nitrogen fixing nodules and how to preserve the soil. This area here, the Old South, soil has petered out. This was a time period before all of the modern chemical fertilizers. And so, how do you rejuvenate the soil? Well, there are certain ways they knew back then. You could let the soil lay fallow. Well, then you had no crop if you just let the soil lay there and did nothing, and you had no income. So they were hoping for better solutions. Well, a solution will come. Unfortunately, it will be after the Civil War. A young boy who was born into slavery, one George Washington Carver, he will become educated and become a scientist. Now, had he have chosen to become wealthy, he could have independently become very wealthy with his science background. But he chose instead to serve his nation, the South in particular. And he said, I can help you rejuvenate your soil. The reason leaving your land lay fallow, not growing anything, rejuvenates your soil is because for plants to grow, they need nitrogen. And one of the main components in air is nitrogen. And so by not growing anything, the air touches the soil that whole year, and nitrogen out of the air is absorbed into the soil. And so the next year when you grow your crops, you have nitrogen in the soil and you get good crops. If you look at a bag of fertilizer, there's usually 3 components predominantly in fertilizer, one of which is nitrogen. And that's what makes your plants green, how much nitrogen you have in your fertilizer. Well, George Washington Carver figured out a faster way to put nitrogen into the soil was to actually grow plants that have nitrogen fixing nodules on them. On their roots, they have these nodules that take the nitrogen from the air and put the nitrogen deep into the soil, not just the air that is touching the soil, but deep into the soil. Well, what plants have nitrogen-fixing nodules? Well, legumes, peas, beans, things like that have nitrogen-fixing nodules. Peanuts have nitrogen-fixing nodules. Well, the South doesn't grow peanuts. The North doesn't grow peanuts. The U.S. consumes very little peanuts at this time. What are we going to do with peanuts? And George Washington Carver tells the South, if you will grow peanuts, you can rejuvenate your soil. And they're thinking, oh, swell, we're going to grow all these peanuts, and what in the world are we going to do with these peanuts? Well, he as a scientist says, if you grow the peanuts, I will come up with uses for the peanuts, from the shell to the nut to the oil, you name it. I will come up with them. And he comes up with over 100 uses for the peanut. Incidentally enough, no, peanut butter is not one of the things he invents, not attributed to George Washington Carver. The peanut oil, latex paints, originally used peanut oil for their elasticity. So the South owes a great debt to George Washington Carver in telling them to grow peanuts to revitalize their worn-out soil. Jimmy Carter, president before your time, I know, referred to as the peanut farmer because he was from Georgia, from the South there. And yes, he actually was a peanut farmer in his background there. So, yes, the South had worn out soil, and this was before George Washington Carver's time. And so they were looking for a scapegoat to blame all their hard times upon. And the tariff is now going to be their scapegoat. Why are we suffering while the rest of the nation is doing so well? It is because of the tariff. And that tariff of abominations, 1828. Here we have one of the cartoons. And we can see up here the North and the South. This is the North. Industry we have in the North. And look at that strong brick building where manufacturing is going on, and they are just doing business. And look at this businessman. He is in fine clothes and he is quite plump, we can see, and the Union in the North is prospering quite well. Meanwhile, the South over here is being hit with tariffs, and taxes. And look what they have. They do not have the strong brick buildings. No, they are living in these thatched buildings with holes in their windows. And look, it says to let. And to let meant to lease or to rent. They didn't even own where they lived. They lived in rundown rentals. They couldn't even afford their own homes. So the old South is suffering, and look at how skinny we are, while other sections of the nation, particularly the North, is prospering so. And, oh, hang on, there, oops, that's not what I wanted. There. And another cartoon here showing the tariff of 1828. And here it says free trade. Free trade is dead. It is being taken in a funeral procession to the tomb. And that tariff, with all of its taxes and horrible rates are causing the death of free trade in this country, particularly in the South. And if it weren't for that tariff of abominations, we could have free trade with the whole world. Yes, just the death of free trade. Southerners believed, not illogically, that the Yankee tariff, as they called it, discriminated against them. They sold their cotton and other farm products produced in a world market completely unprotected by tariffs, and were forced to buy their manufactured goods in an American market heavily protected by tariffs. Towering tariff walls discouraged imports. If a system of completely free trade had existed in 1828, the British would probably have bought more raw materials from those nations that consumed English manufactured goods, rather than sail away from American ports empty. They would have purchased more cotton, tobacco, and other products from the South. On the other hand, though, many failed to appreciate that a prosperous manufacturing Northeast contributed to their prosperity by consuming their cotton and other farm products. So, yes, is consumption from England down? Absolutely. But they don't realize that what are the American textile mills running on? They're running on Southern cotton, while New England is emphasizing manufacturing and not agriculture. Where are they getting their agricultural goods from? The South. And so New England is buying an awful lot from the South. They don't see that. They just see England is buying less from us. Well, the South Carolina Exposition and Nullification. The South Carolinians now take the lead in protesting against the Tariff of Abominations. Their legislature went so far as to publish in 1828, though without formal endorsement, a pamphlet known as the South Carolina Exposition. It had been secretly written by John C. Calhoun. As Adams's vice president, he was forced to conceal his authorship. The exposition boldly denounced the recent tariff as unjust and unconstitutional. It bluntly and explicitly proposed that the states should nullify the tariff. That is, they should declare it null and void within their borders. Good heavens, as the vice president, you are supposed to have the president's back. That is your job. I have so often on TV recently, in the past 3 years, seen Vice President Pence have President Trump's back. And I'm thinking so many times, oh, that's got to be so hard. He has just gotten on TV and said something that he didn't think about before he said. And yet Pence has had to get up there and make the best of the situation and smooth things over. And he has always had Trump's back. He has never stabbed Trump in the back. He has always been his wingman, and Calhoun was to be doing that for Adams. Is he his wingman? Absolutely not. He boldly denounced the recent tariff as unjust and unconstitutional. Do you tell the nation what the president just did was unconstitutional and he never should have done such a thing? It bluntly and explicitly proposed that the states should nullify the tariff. That is, they should declare it null and void within their borders. Man, that is treasonous what he's saying. You states don't have to do what the president just said. Calhoun found himself caught in an awkward straddle. Still a Unionist and a nationalist, he was also a Southern sectionalist. And remember earlier I said all the hubbub in the future for the next 30 years would come out of the state of South Carolina. Guess where John C. Calhoun is from? South Carolina. He was a Southern sectionalist. He therefore desperately sought a formula that would protect the minority of the South from the tyranny of the majority in the North and the West. Seizing upon nullification, he undertook by this explosive device to preserve the Union and prevent secession. So he says, we in the South don't have to secede if we can pick and choose which laws we will and will not abide. And the next election. Well, that may be good thinking. I can stay in the Union if I pick and choose, but that's not going to work. In a family, can you say, I will pick and choose what rules of the house I abide by? No. If it's the rule of the house, it has to be the rule of the house for all, not we all pick and choose which ones we will abide by. In the election of 1828, the Republicans once again ran Adams as their candidate. The Democrats, as they are now being called, ran Jackson. Rallying cries of the Jackson zealots were bargain and corruption. Huzzah for Jackson, and all hail old Hickory. Jacksonites planted hickory poles for their hickory tough hero. Adamites adopted the oak as a symbol for their oakenly independent candidate. Sounds like the battle between the trees, the oaks and the hickories. Shall the people rule was the chief issue of 1828. Jackson and reform was a widely mouthed slogan, while hickory brooms were brandished as tokens of a forthcoming clean sweep. Mudslinging reached a disgraceful level, partly as a result of the taste of the new mass electorate for bare-knuckle politics. Oh, nothing is new under the sun. Every election you think it couldn't get any dirtier. Oh, let me tell you, this was one dirty election. Adams would not stoop to gutter tactics, but many of his backers were less squeamish. They described Jackson's mother as a prostitute. Ooh! They printed black-bordered handbills shaped like coffins. They recounted his numerous duels and brawls, and trumpeted his hanging of 6 mutinous militiamen. Once again, duels were illegal back then. Did that mean people didn't duel? Yes, people still dueled. Remember the Hamilton-Burr duel? This particular anti-Jackson campaigning, here's my cursor. Let me read to you this poster, also like article that they put in the paper. Let me read to you what this says, and here you can see the picture that accompanies it. Do not be startled, gentle reader, at the picture before you. It is all true, and everybody ought to know it. General Jackson, having made an assault upon Samuel Jackson in the streets of Nashville, and the latter not being disposed to stand still and be beaten, stooped down for a stone to defend himself. While in the act of doing so, General Jackson drew the sword from his cane and run it through Samuel Jackson's body. The sword entered his back and coming out of his breast. For this offense, an indictment was found against General Jackson by a grand jury, upon which he was subsequently arraigned and tried, but finding means to persuade the petit jury that he committed the act in self-defense, he was acquitted. Gentle reader, it is for you to say whether this man who carries a sword cane and is willing to run it through the body of any one who may presume to stand in his way is a fit person to be our president. And here, remember, even when he went down into Florida, he hanged people. The old hero was also branded an adulterer, and this he was. He had married an esteemed woman, Rachel Robards. What had happened, he had moved to Tennessee, and he had rented a cabin on the property of Mrs. Donelson's. Mrs. Donelson's daughter, Rachel, had married Mr. Robards and had moved away. Well, she was living with her husband, Mr. Robards, but was unable to keep him from going apparently, maybe not every night, but going and making nightly trips to the slave quarters. And so after 2 years of marriage, she had had enough of this and came home to live with Mama again. Her husband, Mr. Robards, had started divorce proceedings, and she assumed he had finished the divorce proceedings. In the meantime, she met Mr. Jackson, Andrew Jackson, who was renting this cabin on her mother's property. They fell in love, went down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, which was Spanish territory at the time, and had gotten married. They then find out 2 years later that her husband, who she thought was her ex-husband, Mr. Robards, had never finished the divorce proceedings, and she was still technically married. So now she is a bigamist. She is married to 2 men at the same time, and she is an adulterer because she is a married woman having sexual relations with Mr. Jackson. General Jackson is an adulterer because he is having relations with a married woman, Mrs. Robards, who is still married. Well, they then take it into their hands to pay and finish the divorce proceedings with Mr. Robards and get remarried. They are, of course, horrified at this marital miscue and have, of course, taken care of the issue. But now this is all found out, and in an election year, nothing is juicier than this. So Adams' supporters are accusing his mother of being a prostitute, of which that is absolutely untrue. Now, Jackson was born after his father has died. She got pregnant by her husband, and then he passed away. And so Jackson is born after his father has died, and they are accusing his mother of being a prostitute and his wife of being a bigamist and an adulterer, and he of being an adulterer. She will live to see her husband win election in November, but supposedly dies of a broken heart. She will never, by the time he takes office in March, she will not live to that stage. She will die of a broken heart, and this will absolutely kill Jackson. He will never forgive his enemies of this. And so, since he has no first lady, one of his nieces will serve as his first lady. He was always very devotedly attached to his wife, Rachel. Jackson's men, meanwhile, hit back below the belt at President Adams, who had purchased with his own money and for his own use a billiards table and a set of chessmen. But in the mouths of rabid Jacksonites, these items became gaming tables and gambling furniture for the presidential palace. Criticism was also unfairly directed at the large sums that Adams had received over the years in federal salaries, well earned though they had been. He was even accused of having procured a servant girl for the lust of a Russian nobleman while minister to Russia. In short, of having served as a pimp. So your mother's a prostitute and your wife is a bigamist. Well, you served as a pimp while serving as minister to Russia. So nasty, nasty, nasty. General Jackson was victorious at the ballot box. He won 178 to 83 in the electoral count. Support from Jackson came mainly from the West and the South. Adams won most of his support from the Northeast. And we do have a few split votes here. We have Maine, New York, and Maryland, all returning in split votes. This time, though, we do have a majority in the popular, well over 50%, and a majority in the electoral, and that's where it counts, not in the popular, but in the electoral. And John Quincy Adams, the man. You will please read his biography online, on D2L. Picture of him as a young boy. He will start out life at 10 years old, crossing the ocean with his father. This is while we were still in the colonial stage. He will serve as personal secretary to his father. And a little later in life, yes, when he was young, he did have hair. By old age, not so much. And we have some of the first actual photographs of a president. We have no actual photographs of Monroe, but with John Quincy Adams, we have the first photographs. His wife, Louisa Catherine, beautiful woman. While he is serving over in England, he meets and marries her. She is the first foreign first lady. We now have another foreign first lady in the White House with Miss Trump. And when we covered his father, we saw this exact same picture. Their houses only a stone's throw apart, identical architecture, their birthplaces and their houses and their burial places. side by side. Here is, John Adams and Abigail, John and Abigail, and here is John Quincy and Louisa, all in the same burial crypt. Rocked in the same cradle, born in the same house, buried together, father and son. We have a few presidents that continued in political life after they left the presidency, only a few. John Quincy Adams is one of them. He literally dies in the Capitol. 2 years after the presidency, he stays home and then is elected to the House of Representatives. And he would work there for quite a few years. He stands up to discuss something on the floor and suffers a stroke. They haul him upstairs to the Speaker's office where they set up a cot. He lingers there for 2 days and then passes away. They made reference of the similarities to he and George Bush when George Bush died a couple of years ago. George Bush started serving his country at about age 18 when he joined the military, and John Quincy Adams started at age 10 when he served as personal secretary to his father until the day he died in the Capitol building. Very, very long career. I don't think any president has served, as far as I know, no president. He is the longest to have served his country the length that he did. Very long time. John Tyler, he will enter Congress also after his presidency, but we don't like to honor that because he is with the seceded South, and he will enter the Confederate Congress. We also have William Howard Taft. After his one term in office, it's, about 12 years later, he will serve for 8 years on the Supreme Court. He will be actually the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court for 8 years. I'm not off the top of my head remembering any others, but we have had those 3 go back into politics. And I think John Quincy Adams was 18 years in the House of Representatives after he left the presidency. And his funeral, I want to say ticket, not ticket, you know what I mean. And some stamps of our President John Quincy Adams, one from Liberia, United States, here from foreign country. And into, I better plug in my computer here. Next president. Andrew Jackson. And we will go ahead and stop at this point and pick up with Andrew Jackson in the third video.